In the early 14th century, Europe was crowded, trading, and vulnerable. Cities buzzed with merchants. Trade routes like the Silk Road funneled people, goods, and, unknown to them, microbes across continents. Europe's towns were tightly packed. Sanitation was rudimentary, and many communities were already stressed by war, crop failures, and economic strain. It was a world where a single foreign ship could change everything. Historians and scientists trace the origins of the pandemic to the vast trade arteries linking east and west. The bacterium we now call Yersinia pestis likely lived in rodent populations of Central Asia. As caravans and ships pushed farther, infected rats and the fleas on them hitched rides. Wars and migrations created new contact points. By the 1340s, the disease had reached the Black Sea ports, a gateway between the Eurasian interior and the marketplaces of Europe. Quick factual note for the script: modern research refines the picture. While rat fleas played a role, human-to-human and other ectoparasite transmission may have helped the speed and scale. Keep the narration nuanced. Transmission channels varied and scholars still debate the exact mechanisms. In October 1347, Genoese trading ships limped into the Sicilian port of Messina. Their crews were sick, rags soaked with feverish sweat. Sailors were dying. The disease leapt ashore. From Sicily, it moved up the Italian peninsula to Pisa, Genoa, Venice, then across the Alps into France and Spain. Within months, it had spread to ports and inland towns, riding on merchant ships, carts, and in the coats of travelers. Europe's great connectedness had become its most lethal weakness. The disease hit in terrifying, visible ways. Victims developed fever, vomiting, agonizing swellings called buboes, ugly lumps in the armpit, groin, or neck. Some forms progressed to a fatal breathing collapse. The speed varied. In some towns, the sick died within days. The infection tracked trade and migration routes, popping up in port cities, then racing inland during fairs, pilgrimages, and wartime movements. It moved like fire through tinder. We know about the panic and sorrow because people left us their stories, raw, personal, unforgettable. Giovanni Boccaccio, living in Florence during the outbreak, wrote the Decameron, not just fiction, but a vivid eyewitness account. Imagine families shutting themselves inside their homes, terrified to the point they abandoned loved ones who fell ill in the streets. The air was thick with fear and death. Clergy who should have been pillars of comfort either fled or were overwhelmed. Merchants stopped their trades, and neighbors were left to bury each other in haste, often without any proper rites. What's haunting is how everyday life unspooled in chaos. The church bells tolled endlessly, not in celebration, but in mourning. Innkeepers refused service to strangers, fearful of contamination. Town squares emptied. Letters and journals from peasants and nobles alike read like court testimonies, filled with despair and helplessness. But these voices remind us the Black Death wasn't just a statistic. It was a profound human tragedy, experienced by real people with hopes, fears, and losses. We hear their grief echoed in every page, their resilience, and sometimes their disbelief. Some chroniclers even wrote about the small moments of humanity. Neighbors secretly leaving food for quarantined families, doctors who stayed despite the risks, and children playing in the shadow of death. This balance between horror and hope is what makes these narratives timeless. Medicine back then was a patchwork of ancient ideas, superstition, and trial. No vaccines, no antibiotics, just centuries of guesswork. The dominant theory was the humors, a belief that health depended on balancing bodily fluids. Doctors tried to bleed patients or purge them with emetics, hoping to reset this balance. There was also the infamous miasma theory, the idea that bad air caused disease, so people burned incense, herbs, and carried bouquets of flowers trying to cleanse the air. And then there are the iconic plague doctors, with their bird-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, designed to filter foul smells, but in truth, a desperate and ineffective measure. When all this failed, communities often turned to religion and magic. Processions and self-flagellation became common. People whipping themselves, begging God for mercy. Folk remedies flourished, ranging from bizarre to terrifying. Potions made from toads, bloodletting with leeches, or amulets inscribed with prayers. The line between medicine and magic blurred, and fear drove people to try anything. Even the social fabric shifted. Trust in physicians waned, and some blamed medical practitioners for failure, leading to violence. But this period also planted seeds for future scientific inquiry. The failure was a painful but necessary step. Interestingly, some treatments actually made things worse. Bloodletting weakened already frail patients, and crowded hospitals became breeding grounds for infection. It's a reminder how far medical science has come and how dangerous ignorance can be. In times of fear, people want answers, often scapegoats. Tragically, Jewish communities, already marginalized and subjected to prejudice, became targets for blame. Rumors spread that they had poisoned wells or conjured the plague through dark magic. This led to horrific pogroms across Europe. Entire Jewish quarters burned, thousands killed. But it wasn't just hatred that tore societies apart. Fear fractured communities, law and order unraveled, and economic systems collapsed. Markets shut down, craft guilds couldn't function, and villages emptied as people fled or died. The social bonds that held communities together were stretched to breaking. Families lost each other in the chaos. Some fled to the countryside, others were quarantined or locked behind walls. The moral panic itself was a kind of social contagion, as destructive as the disease. Yet in the silence of empty streets and abandoned homes, a quieter story emerged of survival, of those who stayed to tend to the sick, and of the fragile hope that life might go on. This breakdown of social order would shape Europe for decades. Fear bred cruelty, but also resilience. It showed how fragile and how precious community really is. When the Black Death's deadliest wave finally receded, Europe was left in shock and disbelief. Imagine losing nearly 1/3 of the entire population. In some places, even more. Entire villages vanished off the map. Farms went untended, and cities echoed with silence, where bustling streets once thrived. This wasn't just a health disaster, it was a seismic upheaval that rattled the very foundation of medieval life. Think about what that meant. Suddenly, there was more land than people to work it. Labor became one of the most precious commodities anyone could have. Peasants, who had been chained to the land for generations, found themselves with a rare and powerful bargaining chip. For the first time in centuries, they could demand higher wages, better living conditions, and even walk away from servitude. Lords and nobles who had once ruled with an iron fist found their grip loosening. The power balance was shifting right beneath their feet. This demographic catastrophe tore apart the old feudal economic system that had ruled Europe for ages. But here's the twist. Out of devastation came transformation. The very crisis that brought so much death also planted the seeds for economic modernization. With fewer hands to do the work, innovations in farming, new tools, crop rotations, and more efficient practices started to take hold like never before. When labor is scarce and expensive, people get creative. The Black Death became an unlikely catalyst for progress. But this wasn't a uniform story. Some regions bounced back relatively quickly, rebuilding communities and economies, while others languished in poverty and fear for generations. Imagine the survivors, those who lived through horror and loss, waking to a world that was both terrifying and strangely full of opportunity. How do you even begin to rebuild after such a cataclysm? And it wasn't just about economics. The plague tore through the social and political fabric of medieval Europe. Kings and nobles scrambled to maintain control, trying to freeze wages and reinstate old demands on a workforce that was no longer willing to accept the old ways. One of the most explosive reactions was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Picture thousands of ordinary people marching on London, their faces full of anger and desperation, demanding an end to crushing taxes and feudal oppression. Even though the revolt was eventually crushed, it sent a clear message. The old social order was under siege. People were no longer willing to accept their fate quietly. Over time, the rigid feudal obligations gave way to contracts and wage labor, the beginnings of a more modern economy based on markets rather than birthright. This transition wasn't smooth or guaranteed. It was slow, messy, and filled with conflict. But the Black Death sped up these cracks, shaking the medieval world to its core. These revolts weren't just about money. They were about dignity, survival, and the demand for justice. They remind us that when a system stops serving people, resistance is inevitable, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. Some historians even argue these uprisings helped spark legal reforms that laid the groundwork for modern governance, a subtle but profound legacy. In the midst of all this death and despair, faith became both a refuge and a battleground. Many people doubled down on religion, seeking comfort in prayers, rituals, and communal gatherings. Some joined the flagellants, groups who would march through towns, whipping themselves, hoping to punish themselves enough to appease God's wrath. But for many, faith was shaken to its core. Clergy fled, abandoning their flocks in the darkest hours. Trust in the church's authority wavered, opening the door to doubt and skepticism. This spiritual crisis ignited new religious movements and a questioning that would ripple through the centuries. Artists captured this grim reality in powerful and haunting ways. The dance macabre, the dance of death, became a chilling symbol reminding everyone, from kings to peasants, that no one could escape death's grasp. Death was the great equalizer. This collective grappling with mortality left a lasting mark on European culture, dark, introspective, and deeply human. It set the stage for later movements that challenged the church's authority and reshaped spirituality in profound ways. For centuries, people didn't understand what caused this horror. Was it punishment from God? Poisonous air? The stars aligning in some dreadful way? These were the best guesses for a long, long time. It wasn't until the late 1800s, amid new outbreaks in Asia, that science finally cracked the mystery. Alexandra Yersin and other pioneering bacteriologists discovered Yersinia pestis, the deadly bacterium behind the plague. This breakthrough connected medieval tragedy to modern microbiology, showing how invisible organisms could shape the course of history. It opened the door to vaccines, antibiotics, and the tools we use today to fight infectious diseases. Even now, plague outbreaks still happen, though science has given us powerful weapons to fight back. Yersin's discovery reminds us that science is a long, patient journey, built on centuries of curiosity, failure, and determination. But the Black Death was not a one-time event. It was the start of waves that would crash through Europe for centuries. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was one of the deadliest later outbreaks, wiping out tens of thousands in a city of 500,000. Each wave brought new lessons: quarantine rules, isolating ships, early public health boards. These were the early building blocks of modern public health. Pandemics, as history shows, have long tails. They rise and fall, reshape societies, and leave legacies that last for generations. The cultural impact of the plague ran deep. The loss of so many clergy, nobles, and workers upended wealth and power, fueling new waves of art, philosophy, and science. Many scholars believe the Black Death helped spark the Renaissance. Suddenly, patrons with new wealth supported artists and thinkers. Questions about life, death, and human nature blossomed into revolutionary ideas. The grim imagery of death gradually gave way to a hopeful celebration of life. Humanism that still resonates today. Even in tragedy, humanity finds a way to reinvent itself. But let's clear up some common myths. Rats get blamed for spreading the plague, but the real culprits were fleas carried by rats. And sometimes it spread directly between people. Those creepy beaked plague doctor masks. They were real, but more symbolic than effective. The plague story is complex, involving trade routes, social inequalities, medical limitations, and a lot of chance. It's messy, nuanced, and doesn't fit into a neat narrative. Understanding the complexity helps us avoid repeating mistakes and reminds us history is never black and white. So, what can we learn from the Black Death today? It reminds us how interconnected our world is and how trade, travel, and communication bring both opportunity and risk. It shows how fear can breed division and blame, but also innovation and resilience. It teaches us that public health, timely information, and community solidarity are crucial. Most importantly, the story of 1347 shows us that humanity survives not by avoiding crises, but by adapting, learning, and coming together. As we face new challenges, the shadow of the Black Death urges us to look back, so we can build a stronger, wiser future. If you're hungry for more deep dives into history's most powerful stories, the moments that shaped who we are, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and join us next time by the campfire. What era should we explore next? Drop a comment. I'm all ears. Until then, keep the light on, keep stories alive, and let the past guide us forward. See you in the next stories.